So these are extraordinary times, and so I will try to use this talk as an opportunity to make some sense of them. The Russian invasion of Ukraine that began on February 24th, 2022 has and will continue to unleash staggering changes on multiple levels, religious as well as political, certainly for the region, but also I really think for the world at large. So today, I'd like to compare the religious landscape in Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion to consider how it has changed and what we might expect in the future. I will argue that religion is a powerful undercurrent in the war in Ukraine and beyond because it plays a key role in defining relatedness. Although religion has been weaponized and securitized to advance political agendas and protect state sovereignty, these efforts must contend with widespread vernacular religious practices that also inform relatedness and belonging. So if religion is used to foment hatred and legitimate violence, religious actors are also our best hope for advancing the prospects for conflict mediation, peacekeeping, and eventual reconciliation that has to come to Ukraine and Russia. So let's begin. After having studied the localized violence among neighbors in former Yugoslavia during World War II, Max Bergholz argued that violence is a generative force. This war, like so many others, has generated new identities, institutions, and social practices. It has pushed people into sharply defined, polarized groups that are pitted against one another. It has also transformed secularism as a political principle, which in turn has generated changes in public institutions and public space. And although social categories have become more rigid and visible, the secularity of the public sphere in Ukraine is fading. And I think when we take inventory of all that has been destroyed because of this war, among the casualties is likely to be the option of considering oneself just Orthodox, as opposed to claiming an allegiance to a particular religious institution associated with a patriarch who resides in either Kiev, Moscow, or Constantinople. The just Orthodox, or Prosto Pravoslavny, are a group that reflect a type of community that was amorphous and yet prevalent prior to the war in Ukraine. The just Orthodox are a direct outgrowth of the effective atmosphere of religiosity in Ukrainian public space, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So Prosto Pravoslavny could be translated as simply Orthodox, but I understand this group to be setting a limit, which is why I translate it as just Orthodox. They proclaim an allegiance to a confessional tradition, Eastern Christianity, but withhold allegiance to a particular patriarch. They're not undecided or unprepared for denominational choice, as some have suggested. Rather, their sense of orthodoxy is distinctly elastic and blends vernacular religious practices with established traditions of Eastern Christianity, which is one of the reasons why religion and processes of sacralization have become so important and therefore instrumentalized in this war. Ukraine's legacy of being a borderland where multiple empires have historically met, of course, the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, has bequeathed it cultural attributes that are often flexible, expansive, and poorly represented by established categories for studying religion, nationality, and even conflict. Ethnographic research, which is what I do, and by that I mean long-term participant observation and interview-based research, has a real contribution to make in terms of revealing the genealogy of basic concepts, such as being just Orthodox. It reveals how those identities are understood and acted upon. The religious landscape in Ukraine has been transformed, as it has in other countries with Orthodox populations, as well as right here in Tübingen. I want to focus on how this large sector of the Ukrainian population, the just Orthodox, formed and what is likely to become of them as a means of understanding the role of religion in this war. And I'll end with some initial thoughts on the dynamics that I see driving additional changes in the domain of religion, including the deinstitutionalization of religious practice, the sacralization of public space, and the vanishing secularity of history. And then we'll turn to your questions. So first, some background. The first thing here is a map of Ukraine before the invasion. And the first thing I want to note is that this is not a religious conflict, but a conflict with religious dimensions. This is not the first religious war of the 21st century, as some have claimed, but it's a war in which religion, religious organizations, and clergy play a very significant role, and I think will continue to do so in the aftermath of this war. So here is a more current map, and here you get a sense of the fact that 20% of Ukrainian territory is now occupied by Russian forces. So perhaps for some of you, these events are well known. Still, this sequence of events explains why Ukrainians experience the invasion as an intensification of armed combat and not its onset. So the events of 2014 are key. And by that, I mean the Maidan protests, the annexation of Crimea, and the beginning of the Russian-backed insurgency in eastern Ukraine. They galvanized attachments to Ukraine and began to alter self-perceptions. Many people came to see themselves as no longer just residents or citizens of Ukraine, but as Ukrainian patriots, regardless of confessional allegiance and regardless of which language they spoke. There we go. So as threats to Ukrainian sovereignty mounted, a parallel effort to strengthen Ukrainian state borders and a sense of Ukrainian nationhood led to parallel efforts to secure an independent church. In other predominantly Orthodox countries, there's a single Orthodox church according to the principle, one people, one church. And of course, this is why we have the Greek Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox Church, Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and so on. So after nearly more than 30 years of, well, then it was nearly 30 years of independent statehood, state-driven efforts led to another series of events, which you see here. In short, the ecumenical patriarch resumed authority over religious life in Ukraine and granted a tomos of autocephaly, which led to the creation of a Ukrainian Orthodox Church independent from Moscow. This was the first time that religious life in Ukraine was independent from Moscow in over 3 centuries. This also resulted in a bifurcated choice of institutional allegiance. It was framed as either the Orthodox Church of Ukraine under the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople, as they call Istanbul, with religious leadership in Kiev, and an endorsement of European integration on one side, or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, a church that is in communion with the Russian Orthodox Church, but within Ukraine calls itself the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And prior to 2014, this church implied communion religiously and politically with Russia. That has since changed. The key point that I would like you to grasp is that the choice of religious affiliation prior to 2014, but more so thereafter, and certainly even more so after the invasion, is freighted with political connotation. Note that I said political and not national connotation. Prior to the invasion, just to give you a sense of the overall religious background in the country, about 2/3 of the Ukrainian population considered themselves Orthodox. That's about 30 million people. The next largest group was Ukrainian Greek Catholics at around 9%. That is a church in communion with Rome, yet they have a Byzantine liturgical aesthetic and other traditions. About 7 to 8% claim to be just Christian. And then you have a variety of religious minorities, who are very prominent and more than their numbers suggest. And here I'm speaking of Protestants, Jews, Roman Catholics, Muslims, and each is under 2% of the population. So let's think about the just Orthodox. When the Razumkov Center asked, which Orthodox church do you belong to? you see that there has been a persistent large block of Ukrainians who have answered that they are just Orthodox. They decline to name an allegiance to a particular Orthodox church and patriarch. These statistics are countrywide, so they mask regional variations. The number of just Orthodox is higher in Eastern Ukraine, where it reaches around 60%. But the just Orthodox are evidence of a certain soft confessionalism in Ukraine. They merit our attention because they're swing voters, if you will, in this newly created bifurcated choice of churches, whose liturgical, doctrinal, and ascetic traditions stem from the same confessional heritage. However, their understandings of the past and their visions of the future diverge, and this makes all the difference. So here, this chart, I include this so you can see in the 2 years prior to the invasion, it took up until 2021, or 3 years after the creation of the church, with Russian forces amassed along the Ukrainian border, for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine to exceed the number of those that claim that they are just Orthodox. These are the original charts from the Razumkov Center. In case there are people here who speak Ukrainian, you'll see where these numbers are coming from. Lastly, I would just show that this is then, in asking which Orthodox church do you belong to, I would just draw your attention to the huge number, the last one on the bottom is the huge number of people who did not answer the question. So that also bespeaks a certain attitude. So I want to think about, how do you become just Orthodox? So as an anthropologist, the topics I have pursued have always emerged from my fieldwork and from being in Ukraine. This particular group intrigued me because I quickly realized that very few of the established categories and concepts that we use to study religion applied to them. Some were even outright misleading, and by that I mean even the word religion was problematic. When I posed questions concerning religion, religia in Ukrainian, as opposed to vera or faith, I received entirely different answers. Questions regarding religion usually elicited either blank stares, evasiveness, or charges of an arrogant, distant clergy and the self-serving, coercive institutions of which they're a part. But if I asked questions about faith with no mention of the word religion, that often brought forth references among the just Orthodox to a spiritual advisor, duhovnik, and the meaningfulness and the importance of that relationship. And people made references to the illustrious role of Orthodoxy that it has played in enriching and defining Eastern Slavic civilization, and to its numerous accomplishments in the domains of art, architecture, and learning, rather than criticizing the profiteering, power-driven nature of religious institutions. Many just Orthodox deny that they're religious. Few attend church, and few participate in church-based rituals, including communion. Some do not know basic doctrines, and by that I mean things like the 10 Commandments. Yet, many pray regularly. Many go to church to light a candle. They participate in pilgrimages. They attend exhibits, concerts, and performances with religious themes. Yet when I see the just Orthodox actively practicing their faith in such pervasive and public ways, and I note the enormous political influence religious institutions wield, I have to come to the conclusion that people indeed believe, but not always in religion, and they practice to belong, but not always to a church. The allegiance of the just Orthodox is to a faith tradition, more so than to a specific institutional structure, to moral authorities who might be clergy as easily as they could be spiritual advisors, poets, writers. They're committed to honoring the sacred, which they might find in cemeteries, nature, or monuments, far more so than a church. And this shapes practice and political orientations in decisive ways. So I want to focus on the 3 sources that I see contributing to these, making the just Orthodox. Some anthropologists have tried to capture what may be for some the counterintuitive nature of religiosity in Orthodox societies by remaking Grace Davies' succinct depiction of English attitudes towards religion as believing without belonging. And Jana Kormina suggests that belonging without believing is more appropriate for Russians, who she argues are part of a church of the unchurched. Michael Epstein refers to minimal religion to depict the Russian blending of mysticism, faith pure and simple, and estrangement from religious institutions. In Ukraine, the just Orthodox have been called casual believers, sympathizers, прихильники in Ukrainian, and atheists with traditions. They engage in religiosity as a form of self-help in response to the beat of cultural and political rhythms, and out of a desire for cultural belonging, but they do it on their own terms. The vernacular qualities of this lived everyday religiosity simultaneously accommodates a guarded distance and an active attachment to institutional structures, a refusal to be coerced by them, and the desire to belong to something greater than oneself. Vernacular religiosity is a vehicle to overcome institutional disaffection and suspicion of clergy, while capitalizing on the validation and authentication of sacred status and correct practice those institutions and their leaders offer to sites, objects, and people. So this makes for important differences between the just Orthodox and the growing number of nuns in North America and Europe, who decline allegiance to a particular denomination and faith tradition on the grounds that they are spiritual but not religious. The just Orthodox refuse to commit to a particular Orthodox institution, but reaffirm an allegiance to a faith tradition in which everyday religiosity connects them, all the while allowing them to maintain a measured distance from religious institutions that indirectly validate their vernacular practices. Although their attachment to orthodoxy draws on a sense of cultural heritage and patrimony, it's not nostalgic or purely sentimental. Rather, being just Orthodox allows them to reaffirm or negate relatedness, morally validate the relationships that stem from being related, and maintain an effective atmosphere of religiosity that colors their everyday lives. So in short, to learn about the just Orthodox, it became clear to me that it's best not to mention religion, and church might not be the best place to go. The lack of familiarity among just Orthodox of formal religious practices, doctrine, and history, which is often manifest as indifference, is what has prompted scholars to refer to Eastern Slavs as nominally Orthodox, or Orthodox in name only. But I think the concept of nominalism suggests that religion is not important. But I think ethnographic research in Ukraine has shown me that wavering commitments to an institution and critical attitudes towards religious leaders cannot be equated with nominalism, nor with aversion or fossilized indifference. Rather, a pervasive soft confessionalism, which by the way is probably not only found in Ukraine if you start to think about other contexts, shifts religious practice out of religious institutions and into the public sphere. And that has given religiosity, religious institutions, and religious leaders a certain influence when it comes to politics, history, and identity formation that does not always follow traditional patterns. Some states claim secular governance over deeply religious citizenries, such as the United States. And in parts of Europe, we have states that mobilize religion, sometimes in the form of state churches, for the purposes of governing populations that are deeply secular. Being religious or embracing secularism as a political principle of governance in these contexts diverge because the enabling conditions that animate religiosity have shaped them differently. Since the collapse of the USSR, I argue that there has been a deepening of religiosity at the same time that processes of secularization have continued unabated. And in Ukraine, this leaves in its wake a society that is simultaneously increasingly religious and enduringly secular. And the religious practices that I observed, the inclinations to engage in them, and the interpretations of their meaning are idiosyncratic and often tailored to individual needs. Yet because they are so pervasive, And because they draw on a common Eastern Christian faith tradition, they amount to a collective expression of faith that feeds this affective atmosphere of religiosity. This atmosphere and the dispositions, sensibilities, and temperaments that stem from it have allowed religion to enter the public sphere, public institutions, and politics in significant ways. And when an affective atmosphere enhances a transcendent, forward-looking hope for a better future, it primes the persuasive power of religiosity and makes religiosity a political resource that now includes the weaponization and securitization of religion. So let's consider some of these dynamics in more detail. So first I want to turn to these signs in public space, and specifically religious architecture and the aesthetics that stem from this faith tradition. Just to take an example, this is St. Michael's Cathedral, Mikhailovsky Sobor in Kiev. It was leveled to the ground under Stalin's rule in the 1930s. And in the 1990s, independent Ukrainian state meticulously rebuilt it. It originally was in the domain of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate, a breakaway Orthodox church, and now it is part of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So I would draw your attention, let's see if I can see with my little, here, to this monument, for example, the monument to the famine, but you'll notice that it's a sort of a virgin with a child set within a cross. I mean, so an abundant appeal to religious symbolism. On the wall that surrounds this cathedral, there is, it's called the Wall of Remembrance, and there are the photos of, it started out being in 2014, the photos of those who died in Eastern Ukraine fighting in the hybrid war. Obviously, there have been exponentially more deaths, but you see then the blending of a religious institution being used for historical commemoration in highly religious terms. This is Sofisky Sobor, Saint Sophia, also in Kiev. And this is interesting in that this is in the hands of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. But as sort of a leftover of the Soviet period, the land is owned by the Ukrainian state. And there are a variety of museums and other buildings used for educational, commercial, and other purposes. And so at this critical juncture, we now have the Ukrainian state making moves to hand over those properties that it has to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So we potentially then have two Orthodox churches sharing a single property. That's even further enhanced, and this is the Kiev Pecheska Lavra. Also in Kiev, it's one of three of, there are 5 very significant monasteries for Eastern Slavs. 3 of them are located in Ukraine. This is the one in Kiev, and it is in a similar situation in that it is also, all 3 monasteries are in the hands of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And you now have the Ukrainian state intervening to begin to try to tip the balance for these sacred, but also very important historic properties to shift ownership. Religious iconography can also be found. This is a mural of the 10 Commandments that's on a residential building in Kiev, and it's superimposed over a map of the city and children. To the right, frequently buildings go under renovation and panels are set up to cover that. Here you have freedom is our religion in English and in Ukrainian. Svoboda – це наша релігія. And this panel was up for over a year and a half. And this kind of pronouncement of religious allegiance in the public sphere was uncontroversial, as are these other moments of religious iconography. To the left, you have on a commercial property facing out into a main thoroughfare, a shrine to the Virgin Mary. On the right, this is Kharkiv, is a major city in Eastern Ukraine. Right in the metro station, you have an icon-like figure embedded in public space. Just to compound that, let's think about the ways in which religious actors are entering public institutions. This movement is fed by military chaplains. The military chaplaincy was formalized in 2014, so it's not a neutral institution. there we go. This, for example, is an announcement trumping the military chaplaincy and noting the variety of faith groups that participate in the military chaplaincy. But the military chaplaincy instantaneously raised the issue of, can priests from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church associated with the Moscow Patriarchate serve as military chaplains in a Russian-backed insurgent war on Ukrainian territory? And the answer was no. And of course, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is the single largest church. Many soldiers and officers and the like would claim an affiliation with that church. They are, however, and they do serve as volunteers. But the introduction of the military chaplaincy, that really paved the way for the door to open for chaplains to enter medical institutions, and the creation of a medical chaplaincy and a transportation border guards chaplaincy, prison chaplaincy. And there are a variety of chaplaincies also that are oriented towards children. They call it an orphan chaplaincy or a youth chaplaincy, but that embeds members of the clergy in educational institutions. In short, the advent of the military chaplaincy led the way for clergy to become active participants in a wide variety of public institutions. It's also significant that those religious minority groups who tend to have co-religionists abroad played a very significant role in setting up the chaplaincy and in expanding the role of clergy and chaplains in a variety of institutions. And that then brings me to vernacular religious practices and the overall deinstitutionalization of religion. I mentioned earlier that people might not go to services, but they very often go to church to light a candle. They might pray, but sometimes this takes the form of placing prayer requests. On the slide to your left, that's people placing prayer requests in a cemetery, and to the right within a church. And this is very, very common. One places requests to monks who, with their erudite training, are thought to be better positioned to pray on behalf of fulfillment of a particular need. Just Orthodox very often participate in what has been called nomadic orthodoxy by Jana Kormina. That's what she means. That's what she calls the pilgrimages, processions, and other religiously inspired movement. And these practices offer temporary communities that are quickly assembled for specific purposes and once fulfilled, quickly dissolved. Here you see pilgrimages almost always end with a visitation to a sacred spring or some kind of sacred body of water. You can't really see in this picture, but this was taken in February. So there's snow and ice everywhere all around, but it's very common to immerse oneself in water as part of a pilgrimage. This is another such instance. And that has also led to the a more popular the vodokrещение, baptism, evoking the baptism of Jesus in the River Jordan in January, I might add. And so this is a religious ritual which is then performed outdoors. A hole is cut in the ice, and individuals then themselves immerse themselves in full body immersion in water. And because these practices are so prevalent, for example, now we're back in Kharkiv. This is a public park. And once again, you have then the reintroduction, you have the introduction of religious iconography. You have something looking like an iconostas and a hole cut in the ground in the shape of a cross. And then people, once again, in sacred waters bathing. So the prevalence of religious signs in public space and clergy in public institutions, along with these vernacular religious practices, contribute to an overall deinstitutionalization of religious practice. And it allows one to consider oneself meaningfully orthodox without ever entering a church. Non-affiliation and deinstitutionalized religious practice are not necessarily, though, indicators of non-belief, and they should not be equated with indifference to a transcendent realm or to the diminution of the political power of religiosity to shape ethical and moral beliefs and to drive collective directed action. Rather, when non-affiliation and deinstitutionalization are set within an effective atmosphere of religiosity, as I argue they are in Ukraine, this yields a responsiveness to religion as a means of self and collective definition. The pervasive presence of religious signs in public space and the actions of religious actors in public institutions keeps these vernacular religious practices alive and meaningful. And this is what creates this large contingency of just Orthodox sympathizers and casual believers. Their religiosity exists in the spaces between institutional religion and places where everyday life unfurls, like a public park. They're non-practicing only in the sense of formal religious rituals, but often highly active when it comes to engaging in vernacular religious practices. They care that a tomos has been granted and that an independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine has been created, but they don't care enough to actively participate in institutional religious life to help the church thrive. So this begins to reflect some of the myriad possibilities for practicing religion beyond institutional confines, and even the preference for doing so. Religion is extremely important in Ukraine at this juncture because it informs and at times even defines relatedness. Religion links individuals to each other, to groups, to the dead, to the divine, and to a civilizational aesthetic tradition through lived forms of religion. And this is the approach that I've taken to assessing the meaning and the relevance of religion in the lives of individuals in Ukraine. And it's these understandings of relatedness that color an atmosphere that shape the life worlds and the contexts in which perceptions, orientations, and political behaviors form. These kinds of vernacular practices reveal the extent to which a place is embedded in entangled histories and interweave institutional religion with customary practices. And this allows us to think beyond a narrow nation-state model, because no nation or state, and especially not one like Ukraine that is situated in a borderland region that has been the site of volatile political struggle over the course of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, can be considered a self-contained unit. Connections matter not only to place, but to the relatedness among peoples who become linked in history, aesthetic sensibility, and understandings of morality. The existence of these entanglements is evidenced in the interlocking past and the everyday present that inform hierarchies of space, colonial reflexes, and institutional frameworks. Global flows do not just bring people's ideas and goods together, they order hierarchies and power that inform the conditions of how spaces and peoples are interconnected. The lands now known as Ukraine and Russia have always been interconnected. They're just increasingly interconnected in different ways, and religion is a driving force in this regard. This leads me to recall Talal Asad. If there's any anthropologists in the room, perhaps you are familiar with his book, Is Critique Secular? And by secular, he and his colleagues meant a principle that centers on reason and purports to advance a certain neutrality towards religion. He asks, does perhaps all critique carry religious overtones or religious innuendos? The overall point was that delineations between a religious worldview and a secular one, between a religious truth and a secular truth, can be perilously thin because the public sphere is never as neutral as secularism claims it to be. And this is especially true when the public sphere is characterized by an effective atmosphere of religiosity. And this is what brings me to, is history still secular? Given the similarities in the liturgical, doctrinal, and aesthetic styles of both the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, and their competition for the just Orthodox, history has become sacralized and in a political vein performatively enacted in vernacular religious practices in public space. So I want to just cite two examples here of how history itself has become part of these vernacular religious practices. Before the invasion, the key issue was World War II. Should one in Ukraine commemorate it in a European vein, that is to say, refer to it as World War II, or the Soviet way, turned Russian, the Great Patriotic War? When is Victory Day? Is it May 8th or is it May 9th? Which commemorative tradition should be followed? That has given way to Kievan Rus, especially becoming now one of the most disputed aspects of history. The Christianization of Rus happened in Khersones, which is in Crimea, and that was the gateway, the argued gateway to the advent of Orthodoxy, leading to the Russian world. That is to say, the shared adherence of Orthodoxy as a common spiritual and cultural tradition among Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. And this, for example, in Mr. Putin's view, is what makes these Ukrainians and Russians one people. But when these mythological narratives are embraced by religious institutions in open collective performances, such as processions, as you see here, public prayer, and other forms of pageantry, they become devotional acts. And when they are performed in decidedly secular public settings, they fuel this effective atmosphere of religiosity and make people orthodox. The only problem is as Tim Snyder has argued, historical myth is a bit like dancing with a skeleton. It gives the illusion of truth to a dead idea. But the performative, sensual, and symbolic means they have at their disposal, religious institutions have at their disposal, to not only articulate a vision of the past with moral authority, but also to make people experience it through ritual, can be highly persuasive. And this is what religious institutions offer politicians. Now, these are, I think I'll skip these just for the interest of time. So now when you have a war, this is a monument that happened, or an action that happened in Lviv, where they put baby carriages out on to symbolize the number of babies that had been killed at that time. This changes, this is going to begin to change the tenor of religious life. One of the driving forces have been statements by the Russian patriarch, where on here, the day the invasion occurred, we see that Patriarch Kirill does not condemn the war. And he calls on the entire fullness of the Russian Orthodox Church to offer a special fervent prayer for the speedy restoration of peace. Similarly, on Forgiveness Sunday, he cites as a legitimation for the invasion the need to hold at bay gay pride parades. And this is part of an overall effort advanced by the Russian world and specifically by the Russian Orthodox Church to advance traditional Christian values. And the Russian Orthodox Church sees itself as the fortress there. Needless to say, when the death and devastation reaches the levels as it did in Irpin, for example, in April 2022, this places enormous stress on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And so I'd like to just to wrap up very quickly now, give you a sense as to what the likely fate of this church may or may not be. There is a tremendous push, sort of a Volksinitiative in a sense, sort of from the ground up, of people pressuring priests then to initially not mention Mr. Putin during services, and increasingly not to mention Patriarch Kirill in services. This has then expanded to a sense of Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate priests coming together and signing a petition in an appeal to the Orthodox leadership globally to charge Patriarch Kirill with heresy and prosecute him for that crime. So in short, what is happening is that this pressure of the connections to the Moscow Patriarchate are straining a sense of wanting to be related or in communion with Russians, and specifically with the Russian Orthodox Church. It's important to note that 1/3 of the Russian Orthodox churches are located in Ukraine, and a very significant number of the clergy and believers are also in Ukraine. So should there be any kind of separation, this would be a very significant loss to the Russian Orthodox Church. Interestingly, while there have been some reaffiliations to the other church, there have not been many. There's a sense that the new church is a political creation, which it is. Without the role of the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko pushing that forward, it probably would not have happened. And because it's seen as an artificial political creation, and yet the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate within Ukraine is not necessarily seen as the arm of Patriarch Kirill or Putin or anybody else from Russia within Ukraine. For a great many Ukrainians, they experience it as their church. And more so, they experience it as a historically and spiritually grounded church. So for that reason, there have not been as many reaffiliations as you would think. However, I suspect that this ongoing formal relationship with Russia will be unsustainable, and the longer the war goes on, the more strained it will be. So this means we might have multiple official Orthodox churches within Ukraine. And then one begins to ask oneself, given the tremendous similarities in liturgy, doctrine, aesthetic traditions, will these kinds of politicized interpretations of the past and political positions for the future be sufficient to distinguish them? Or might we see theological differences emerging between two different kinds of orthodoxies? It would already be an extraordinarily significant departure to have multiple Orthodox churches in a single country. I also foresee religious minorities, including the Greek Catholic Church, coming to play an ever greater role in religious life in Ukraine. The Ukrainian response to the Russian world has been to suggest the Kievan tradition, that is to say, a tradition of ecumenicism in Ukraine. Unlike in Russia, the Orthodox Church cannot claim to be the national church, because the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church also claims that. So they're sharing right from the start. But that then opens the door for a very significant role for religious minorities who, as I mentioned earlier, certainly in terms of the chaplaincy, but especially these days in terms of delivering humanitarian aid, are playing very, very, very significant roles. And they play the kind of roles that, for example, UNICEF won't go into Mariupol, but it's these religious groups that will. And so in that sense, I see a greater role for religious minorities within Ukraine developing. All of this, though, is of course happening against the backdrop of a growing militarization, which is in part led by the churches. And this is occurring in Russian and Ukrainian societies. And that then you start having politics, geopolitical imagination, and the like drawing on religious concepts. So in other words, this is where you get an evil occupier, and this is where historical critique can become blasphemy and the like. In other words, so the projection of religious concepts into political dialogue and political life accelerates tensions. Having said that, the most trusted entities in Ukrainian society remain churches, and along with that, volunteer fighters in particular. And so military chaplains are really the ultimate beneficiaries of this trust, and they have really risen to become something of public intellectuals. And that is something that I certainly would never have expected even a few years ago. So just to really wrap up, the just Orthodox, in my view, are emblematic of the important role that religion in defining public space, public institutions, and self and collective perceptions. In particular, those three entities help define who one is related to, who one feels an obligation to, and where one belongs. And prior to the war, the just Orthodox were also emblematic of the religious pluralism and tolerance for a broad spectrum of attitudes towards religion and faith, towards inclusive forms of deinstitutionalized religious practices that allow sympathizers, agnostics, and the pious to practice together. But given this growing militarization, when the war ends and we take inventory of all that has been destroyed, I suspect there will be far fewer just Orthodox. But I surely hope that among the casualties, we will not find the pluralism and the tolerance that they embody. So thank you for your attention. You've been very patient.